Welcome to Rational Animal. Today we're going to be talking with Dr. Douglas Beaumont about his conversion from evangelicalism to Roman Catholicism. And we're going to focus more on the experience of conversion since he's written and spoken about this topic on a more academic level in other places. And part of our conversation is going to be about the role, or at least the potential role, SES might have in the conversion of its students to Roman Catholicism. Hey, Doug, thanks for being on the show today.
Good to be on, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so if you could start out by giving us your background, like did you grow up a Christian? What is your educational background? And kind of how you went from where you were before you even became a Christian to Catholicism. If you could just give us a little bit of a background like that, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was not raised a Christian in particular. My family didn't really go to church, except maybe the occasional Easter, Christmas, that kind of thing. But I would never really say I was an atheist. I just was living as if I was. I was kind of a theistic agnostic. I thought there was a God, but I wasn't sure enough about him to really care enough to have my life altered in any way. So I really became a Christian proper after high school, just in between the summer in between college and high school. And a lot of the reason I became a Christian was because I ran into several people in a row that were giving me really good answers to the questions I'd had that nobody had really been able to answer very well before. And so that became important to me. I wanted to be able to be that person for other people. And so I really just jumped right in with both feet, started studying theology. I was really into studying the cults. And I wanted to have an answer for the reason of my faith, if anybody asked. So I spent my undergrad doing that. And during that time, some people said that I should look into going to seminary. But the problem is all the seminaries that I looked at, they were either preparing you to be a pastor or a missionary. And I really didn't want to do either one. But I discovered Southern Evangelical Seminary, clear over in North Carolina. I grew up in California. A school that Norman Geisler, one of my heroes of the faith, had started. And the interesting thing about Southern Evangelical at that time was it was one of the very few schools that were not only teaching apologetics at all, but were actually offering an entire master's degree in apologetics. So it didn't take me too long to decide to sign up for that. And I got married. My wife and I moved to North Carolina. And this was in about the year 2000. So started in at seminary. I actually was very involved. I became Dr. Geisler's grad assistant for a couple of years while he was working on his systematic theology. And once I graduated in 2004, they had me stay on. I directed the distance education program for the school. I was even their webmaster for about a year. And I helped get a lot of stuff started. This was a big time of transition. We had moved into our own building. We were starting an undergrad program called Southern Evangelical Bible College. So I was helping them out with that. And they also started a church. So we had Southern Evangelical Church, we weren't the most creative people with the titles. Everything was Southern Evangelical something. Mm-hmm. And then after a few years, we started a PhD program. And so Dr. Richard Howe and JT Bridges and I basically got that program rolling. We were the only ones involved really that first year. And then about halfway through my PhD program, I started really looking into some of the deeper issues that interested me about Christianity, but that I didn't really feel like I had kind of hit bedrock with yet. There were still some lingering questions that I wasn't quite sure how to deal with. And because I was essentially getting paid full time to read and be a professor, it afforded me a lot of opportunity to delve into these issues. I was working at the PhD level on some of these questions. And about 3 or 4 years into this process, I started kind of seeing the writing on the wall and seeing that I was probably headed out of evangelicalism for sure, maybe into Orthodoxy, maybe into Catholicism. But in about 2015, I kind of officially quit my PhD with Southern. I stopped working there, and I really just needed to kind of get some distance from the whole thing. And I didn't want to feel like I was misrepresenting myself, and I was starting to have some issues with faculty and students. So just thought it'd be better if I left. And then that summer, I joined the RCIA program at local Catholic church, figuring if I was going to get out and not become Catholic, that's when it would be.
Right.
But I didn't. And so in 2016, I was formally accepted into the Catholic Church, and I finished my PhD with another school that accepted my work from Southern, and then did my dissertation through them. And then it was just a few years later that I got hired on as the director of faith formation at a parish back in California. So wife and kids and I moved back, and that is where I am today.
Awesome. Yeah. So you don't have a Catholic background. It's not like you grew up Catholic, went kind of AWOL, and then you became evangelical, and then now this is like a journey back home for you.
Yeah, no, not at all. In fact, I was quite anti-Catholic. Not very self-aware as far as the anti-Catholicism went. It just kind of came with the territory. And so I read a couple books and basically copied what I read in there into web pages and stuff like that it should all be gone now. But it wasn't until I came to Southern that I even opened my eyes really to what Catholicism really was, because we spent a lot of time studying Catholics at the seminary, and that was really where the transition began. But yeah, no background in Catholicism at all, other than trying to get people out of it.
Right. I think I recall you telling me a time when you had talked to a common friend named Jeremiah, and he was giving you arguments for Catholicism, and I recall you mentioning, "Oh, these are pretty weak arguments," right? At one point, or not that convincing?
I probably said that at one point, hoping that I was right. But yeah, so before I became the director of distance education at SES, Jeremiah had that position. And he was actually the one that kind of set me up to take it over when he left. So then about a year and a half, 2 years later, we get word that Jeremiah had become Catholic. And this was a huge shock because most of us were not in conversation with him. He hadn't really consulted us or anything on his way in. And because Jeremiah and I had been friends, I wrote to him and we started a very long, robust, in-depth email conversation about it. And my recollection, I don't know when I talked to you about it, but my recollection was actually of getting pretty stomped in a number of places. Not necessarily that I was becoming convinced, but it was just like, I just realized I didn't know a lot. There were a lot of things that I just sort of had this very vague intuition about. And when I would challenge Jeremiah with those things, he had thought through those things as well, because he was kind of coming from the same background I was. And so he just always had a response, kind of like those guys that helped me become Christian in the first place. But I finally, what kind of ended the conversation was this argument that I thought I had come up with. Of course, I hadn't. But it seemed to me that he was using his mind and his authority over his own thoughts to choose the Catholic Church, and I was using my authority and my mind to not choose it. But he seemed to think he had some kind of epistemic advantage over me. And to me, it looked like we were doing exactly the same thing. And that's really where the conversation, kind of petered out.
Right. Okay, so this might be a good time for me to kind of back up and do a little disclaimer, right? Because I think both of us appreciate our education at SES. I mean, I know I did.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
I think people watching this from SES might think, oh, well, you just have it out for SES. That's not at all the case, I don't think. And it's more, I have an appreciation for SES for the way it formed my thinking about all sorts of things, right? So this isn't, while I may myself or maybe Dr. Beaumont Doug's maybe makes some references to SES, that's not to say that I'm not appreciative of what SES does, has done, or anything like that. But there are issues, right, that SES I don't feel like they've really resolved, and I think it's important to at least discuss those.
Yeah, I would agree. In fact, even in the book that may come up later, several of us that became Catholic, including Jeremiah, got together and wrote a book where each of us took a chapter and kind of gave our personal stories about why we became Catholic, and then we followed it with 4 chapters on some of the most important issues and how we think those were resolved. But we said right in the book, that we all appreciated Southern Evangelical very much. In fact, I had one of the authors threaten to leave the project if we didn't do that. So This was definitely not a hit piece. This wasn't a bunch of angry people writing, oh, we're going to show SES. If I was behind the scenes. I saw a lot of things go down that a lot of other people didn't. And like I've said before, if I wanted to write a hit piece on SES, I could. There's some people I could throw pretty far under the bus. And this was, I have not done that. And I certainly did not even, approach it that way when it came to the book, Evangelical Exodus. Rather, this was a response to what a lot of people from SES were saying, because I had been around for 10 years. I heard what they said about Jeremiah. I heard what they said about Brian, and all these guys. I mean, I was there in those faculty meetings, listening to people all the way to the president talk about these converts. And I was also around for a lot of the student conversations and even, my kind of mid-level. I kind of knew what was going to happen when I became Catholic. And so to kind of head it off at the pass, I just got a bunch of guys together out of the 20 or 24, people that I knew at the time from SES that had become Catholic. I just put it out there to everybody. Hey, would anybody like to tell your story? Let's get it in print somewhere official. And 9 of us ended up writing it. Francis Beckwith, who was a faculty convert, wrote the foreword. And I just think it's important to get the real story out there. And so that's where that book came from. That wasn't an attack on SES, even though that's how it was received.
Yeah, well, it's a curiosity, right? Like why so many people from a particular seminary would go Catholic, or and some of them I think went Eastern Orthodox.
Yes, yep.
And that was being noticed not just by people within the seminary, but even people outside the seminary. You have people like James White, other notable figures in the Reformed tradition especially, saying, what's happening over here at Southern Evangelical Seminary that all these people are becoming Catholic?
Right. And a lot of Geisler's, I mean, SES was Geisler, let's face it. But, I think a lot of those Reform guys, especially James White, I mean, their dislike of Norm's process and thinking is not a secret. But yeah, when you look at the kinds of things we studied, the way we studied them, the way we even did apologetics, it was very much kind of the antithesis of what you see in the Reformed world. And so, yeah, a lot of those guys have a big problem with the seminary. And so every time somebody became Catholic, that was just like, well, there you go.
Right.
We've been right all along. Look what happens when you go to SES, you become Catholic. And, those numbers may not seem very high. We're probably talking about maybe 30 people that I could name. But that's a larger number than the average graduating class. We tended to top out at around 300 students, I think. If I remember my numbers right, and you'd get about maybe, 30 people a class. The school had been around for about, 96 that SES got started? I can't remember.
The 90s, yeah.
Yeah, mid-90s. And so this is all happening, in the first decade or so of the 2000s. So that's a pretty big number for a school of that size.
Mm-hmm.
It was enough that definitely people were noticing, and they were very spread out too. That's what's interesting. I've talked to people that weren't even part of the SES experience, but just knew Norm that are Catholic now. This is something that's been ongoing, and so when you have 2 or 3 people every year becoming Catholic, that is kind of a big deal, especially a school of that size. The other thing too is, and I'm not trying to pump myself up here, but they tended to be some of the more important people. These were not people that just drifted off into obscurity once they got their degree. These are a lot of people that went on to pursue their PhD that are teaching at the graduate level now. These are Norm Geisler's grad assistants. These are people that were on faculty. These are people that were on staff. So it wasn't just a random selection of students that came for a year or two and then went off and became Catholic and no one knew about it. Many of them were important because of the role they played at the seminary before they became Catholic.
Okay, so I think at one point, I think we were on a hike or something like that, and you were talking about leaning towards Eastern Orthodoxy. Like there was a lot of appeal of Eastern Orthodoxy, at least at one point. What happened there? What was the kind of final turn for you to go from Orthodoxy and being persuaded and drawn by that to Catholicism?
Yeah, my background with Orthodoxy is a little weird. When I was in my undergrad, there was a skeet, which is kind of a female monastery that was right in town, and our local college paper had done a write-up on them. And then they, like, literally the day that I read that article, the women from there came into the store where I was working, and so I recognized them, and we started talking, and they invited me out, and I ended up spending the whole day out there one time just kind of learning about Orthodoxy and these weird, people. Anyway, to fast forward, when I was doing recruitment for Southern Evangelical Seminary, another job that I had there, one of the priests from St. Nectarius, which is an Eastern Orthodox church that was right around the corner from the seminary, came in, and he was interested in taking classes, which I thought was hilarious because, I mean, there was no way we were going to let an Eastern Orthodox priest, in at the seminary. And so I explained to him what our doctrinal statement was and that you had to be able to sign it to be a student. And he was just sort of blown away by the whole thing. It was clear he just really had no idea what we were about. But I just always found it fascinating. Their churches were beautiful. Ours were movie theaters and gyms. You could tell when an Orthodox priest walked by. They looked awesome. They looked like somebody that, stepped out of the 5th century. Mine are wearing Hawaiian shorts and t-shirt, So I started looking into Orthodoxy doctrinally when I started seeing the problems with evangelicalism, because, well, just to kind of fast forward and spoilers here, the answer to several of the biggest questions that I had were go back to the ancient church. That's where the answer is. So, of course, I knew enough at this point to know what that meant. You follow the ancient church forward, you're basically either looking at Catholicism or Orthodoxy. I mean, that's like the two big choices, right? So I found myself attracted to Orthodoxy in contrast to Catholicism, because a lot of the things that Protestants have a problem with in Catholicism aren't in Eastern Orthodoxy, right? So, we don't like the Pope. Eastern Orthodoxy doesn't have a Pope. We don't like, Mary that much. Well, they like Mary, but she's not that big of a deal. Not true, but in my mind, that was kind of it. The Orthodox, they didn't even have the Reformation. There's no such thing as Protestants in that world. What about the Crusades? You don't got to worry about just all the kind of Protestant triggers. Nearly all of them are absent from Orthodoxy. And so, I go to St. Nectarius, and it's just beautiful liturgy. Yeah. These priests are men, they're up there swinging these giant, thuribles and, the incense. I mean, you almost can't see the altar from all the smoke. I mean, it's just like, yes, like for someone that's looking into the ancient church, it just seems like it's got it all. And it doesn't have any of the junk that I have to deal with, constantly having to be an apologist, because I knew I'd never stop being an apologist. So if I became Catholic, guess what's going to happen? I'm going to be a Catholic apologist. And at the time, I just really didn't want to. Like, I don't want to defend the Inquisition. I don't want to defend Mary. I don't like any of that stuff anymore now, than I did when I was 100% evangelical and didn't really see any issues with it. So Orthodoxy was a huge draw. In fact, I actually, we did field trips in my, what was it called? I think it was like world religions and new religious movements or something, but it was the Bible college class that taught about world religions and cults all kind of rolled into one. And so, because I didn't really like teaching it that much, we spent several classes on field trips. So we would go to a Buddhist temple, some kind of Eastern, we go to a mosque, and then just to kind of freak everybody out, I would take them to St. Nectarius and we'd go to an Orthodox liturgy. Now, the reason I did that is because when I was teaching Christianity in the way that I would teach these other religions, it came out looking completely different than most evangelicals were used to. Because the way you teach world religion is you just go through the history. Here's the founder, here's their beliefs, here's what they do, and so I always loved opening the class by teaching Christianity like that for about 30 minutes and then asking, how many of you would say I've just described what you believe? And none of the hands would go up. They wouldn't even know half the stuff I was talking about. And I would say, just, keep that in mind, that you're going to learn Buddhism, but if you go meet a Buddhist, there's a very good chance that what you know is not going to sound anything like what they think. So I was trying to take a very objective look at things. And what I discovered was, when you teach Christianity historically, it looks like the Orthodox or the Catholic Church. It does not look like evangelicalism. And to kind of drive that home, that was our third field trip, was we'd go to St. Nectarius, and then everybody could batter the priest with questions. And one of their priests was an ex-Baptist. Mm-hmm. So it was just fantastic experience. Everybody loved it. But as some people grew in their interest, these are friends of mine, not my students, but as some friends grew more and more interested. We actually got a class going there, kind of an RCIA, if you know what that is, for Catholics, for Orthodox. And 2 or 3 people became Orthodox from SES. And this is long before I was making my decision. Yeah, so that really lasted, right? I mean, that was really probably what kept me from becoming Catholic the longest there at the end, was that I still had this other decision to make. And really, it's not based on the kinds of things that made me question evangelicalism. Once I knew that the ancient church was the answer, if there was only one branch of it, that would have been kind of the decision made. But because I was still not sure about Orthodox versus Catholic, that kind of kept the conversation going for a lot longer.
Okay, so I see the appeal of orthodoxy. What was the kind of the final reason for going to Catholicism rather than orthodoxy?
Well, I think there were a couple. And a lot of this honestly came from the Orthodox. I mean, they would literally tell you this is the way it is. One thing is that I became convinced that the Nicene Creed is accurate, and that the church is one, it's holy, it's Catholic. And so when you look at that, unity is a big part of that. That one, there's only one church. And I believe with the Catholics that the Eastern Orthodox Church had apostolic, a continuous apostolic line. So they had valid sacraments and they had all those kinds of things. But it seemed to me that in America, at least, it was a very segregated church. In other words, you've got a Greek Orthodox on this corner and a Russian Orthodox on the other corner. And it's just, as a movement, it's just very much tied to ethnic lines.
Sure.
Enough Greek people move into a neighborhood, they bring a priest over, and up pops a church.
A really nice church.
Yeah, that's right. Usually a very nice, beautiful church, like we had. So that was one thing, was just that, I'm not Greek. I'm not Russian. I'm not going to turn, as much as I like their food afterwards and everything, it was obvious, like, this is a Greek community. Mm-hmm. This is a Russian community. And I'm never going to be that. I'm not going to teach my kids this language. And so even though I really liked what it was, kind of as a participant, I didn't see myself becoming Orthodox to my bones, where I was going to be teaching and speaking and doing all the stuff that I did as an evangelical, as an Orthodox person. The other thing is just there is disunity there that is a lot stronger than you see in Catholicism. In other words, it's a hierarchical, official division. So you have some groups that don't even recognize the other groups as being Orthodox. So there's a lot of that, and I didn't want it to just be Protestantism part 2. I mean, granted, it's a far cry from Protestantism, but since that was one of my main issues, it was something that was kind of a red flag for me, that I don't know if I really want to deal with that. Mm-hmm. Another thing was that whereas Catholics are very accepting of the Orthodox and consider them a true church, consider their sacraments valid, it seems like the Orthodox take a very dim view of Catholicism that I just think is unrealistic. You've got these ethnic bounded groups that are barely universal. These groups that have not had an ecumenical council in 1,000 years. And for them to claim to be the true church and that Catholicism isn't, is very problematic for me. I get that they disagree with what Catholics believe, but it just seemed like they went way too far. So, those things, and again, I had good friends that were becoming Eastern Orthodox, and I totally supported that, and I was, very happy with that they did those things. But for me, knowing what I know, that was going to be an issue. And then finally, I can't remember the author right now, but one of the converts that I read very briefly brought it up in his book, and he said, at the end of the day, for better or worse, I'm a Western Christian. I'm not giving up Augustine. I'm not giving up Aquinas. I'm not gonna chuck the Western expansion of Christianity into the entire world to read Palamas. It's like, he might be interesting, but I remember what Brandon Dahm said one time. He said, history happens for a reason. And yeah, for whatever reason, the church that is universal is the Catholic Church. I mean, that's just basically a fact. So
what do you mean by that?
I didn't want to move into some, huh?
What do you mean by that? The church that is universal is the Catholic Church.
Sorry. What I mean by that is that, pretty much anywhere you go, the Catholic Church is there. you can move into a town that doesn't have an Eastern Orthodox church. You can move into huge areas that don't, that have no representation, or maybe there's a little church there, but there's like 4 families that go to it. It just historically and objectively speaking, it's the Catholic Church that has changed the world. It's the Catholic Church that started the university system and was building hospitals and orphanages and stuff when, people in the Americas were still sacrificing babies to statues. God used the Catholic Church to change the world. And so for me, knowing that the Catholicism, the universality of the church is one of its marks, it just seemed ridiculous to join a group that didn't think the Catholic Church had that. That was just too far for me.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. Here's a tricky question. All right. What role do you think the teaching at SES played in your conversion? Right. So obviously there's a strong Thomistic leaning in SES among the professors and whatnot. Some of the concern there is, well, Thomism naturally leads to Catholicism. The rebuttal to that is often, well, we can adopt his metaphysics and epistemology and ethics and things like that without going full bore into Roman Catholicism. I guess, what do you think about that? But also just what do you think in terms of how much or what role Thomistic thinking SES had in your conversion? And if I could just one more thing, not just the emphasis on Aquinas, but also the emphasis on the historic Christian faith, right? Because throughout the systematic theologies and Geisler's systematic theologies, there's a lot of reference to it being the historic Christian faith, the things that he's teaching. So maybe that emphasis on the historic Christian faith on the one hand and Thomism on the other, what did that foster it? Did it provide just the categories for making sense of Catholicism? Does it naturally or of necessity lead to Catholicism? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was a big part of the response. I mean, I don't know if it's still there, but SES used to have like an entire response to Evangelical Exodus on their website. And it was mostly just links to papers and things like that. But, that was the main concern, was, are we as a seminary creating Catholics? Which it kind of seemed like they were, right? Because again, if you average it out over the years, you're losing something like 15-20% of your students. If you look at the graduating class and the number of Catholics that year. I think it's a wide range of things. For one thing, I would say on one extreme, no, it is not of necessity that you become Catholic. I mean, you can obviously, lots of people have gone through SES and not become Catholic, and they're just as anti-Catholic, however much they were as they were when they started. So it's definitely not that. And I would say that to some degree, the response that, well, we're classical when it comes to metaphysics and epistemology, but not Thomistic with our theology is true. I mean, I think you can draw a line between someone's metaphysics, which is basically Aristotelian, and theology, which is Catholic. You obviously can have one without the other because Aristotle wasn't Catholic. Thomas Aquinas was adopting a lot of his philosophy and applying it to Christian theology, but it wasn't necessarily the other way around. So a Protestant is free to take Aristotelian philosophy and try to apply it to Protestantism. I don't think it works very well, but it can be done, at least in theory. And I think that's what SES was trying to do. Was trying to say, look, you've got good metaphysics here. This is a good realist metaphysic. We're not nominalists. We've got a good epistemology here, and all of these things are necessary for the kinds of truth claims that Christianity makes. So we're going to go with those. We're going to adopt those. Whereas you don't see that at all on the Reformed side. They basically had to make up a brand new way of even doing apologetics, so that they would have their own way to do it. And Aristotelian type categories and classical thinking just don't fit with that at all. So what's on the other hand? The other hand, I would say 2 major things. Number one, there is a very big emphasis on classical theology. Now, it's not always done correctly, but they're at least trying. They're aiming for the theology of the church. And this is why, like, if you read Dr. Geisler's systematic theology and a lot of his other books, part of his apologetic is always going back to the church fathers and trying to find statements that match what he teaches. And I know this because when I worked on 2 of the 4 volumes of the Systematic Theology, that was my job. In fact, you helped me. Basically, okay, here's a thing I believe. Go find me some church fathers that, sound like they agree with that. So yeah, Dr. Geisler was always wanting to be very classical with his philosophy and very historic with his theology. And in theory, there's a way to navigate your way through all of that and remain evangelical, because, you can always find a quote here or there that kind of sounds like, justification by faith alone, or, supports the rapture, or whatever else you've got. Over 2,000 years, everybody's going to say something eventually that sounds kind of like it. And if you frame it in the right context, it can sound like the whole church has always taught free grace, or, that sort of thing. So I know that it was a concern. And so I think that in general, those concerns definitely favor Catholicism. I mean, if you want classical philosophy, well, who adopted classical philosophy? The Catholic Church did. If you want the historic Christian faith, well, who has the claim to the historic Christian faith? The Catholic Church does. So to the degree that I think that those things are important to you in the abstract, when you actually make them concrete, it's very difficult to stay evangelical. You might be able to be a classical philosopher in the sense that you adopt, again, Aristotelian metaphysics, epistemology, that kind of thing. But it's never going to transition over into the theology. The only thing you're going to be able to back up is what the Catholic Church shares with evangelicalism. But what makes evangelicalism be evangelicalism does not fit with the historic Christian faith. I mean, that's just a fact. Whether it's right or wrong, true or false, it's not the historic Christian faith. That's just objectively true. And I remember I wrote an article on my blog about this that got me in a bunch of trouble. They actually kicked me out of the seminary and told me I was banned from the premises by the president, Richard Land. He's not the president anymore. But this was before Evangelical Exodus came out. I was literally the only one in the building because the place was basically a ghost town by that point. And they kicked me out too, just because I had written about this thing about Norman Geisler, who didn't even work at the school. He was still persona non grata at that point. So they take the claim very seriously, and it bothers them very much when you point out, well, this isn't historic though. My gosh, you guys are dispensationalists. That's what, 1830, 1850. Your free grace, that's 10 minutes ago, Dallas Theological Seminary. You put in your Baptist doctrines, well, that's 16th century at the earliest. There's just a whole bunch of stuff that just doesn't really lay claim to the historic faith. What they mean by historic is this is what the apostles taught. And the way you know what the apostles taught is you interpret your Bible correctly, which is completely circular, but that's how they get away with that.
Okay, so if I can follow up on that a little bit, because I think there is maybe a tendency, or at least these are things that when talking with people I've heard are sort of characterizations of your conversion and other conversions along the lines of, oh, you like the smells and bells, right? Like this was more of an aesthetic draw, and it's just kind of the reasons kind of followed behind that. And I guess that's part of the reason why I asked the question about if Thomism and that emphasis on the historic Christian faith was something that undergirded that movement. And I know from your book, the Evangelical Exodus and others, like you are actually offering arguments in favor of those. Now, the claim that it was just an aesthetic thing that you formed your reasons behind, that seems to be something that you'd have to argue for, not just assert, and then deal with the actual arguments rather than just, kind of presuming that. But I think what I'm interested in hearing too is this didn't, at least when we had talked about it when you were going through the process of weighing these issues, like this wasn't an easy decision for you, right? Like you weren't just like, oh, that was a cool service, I think I'll become Catholic. You had a job on the line, you had a reputation on the line, other factors included. I was wondering if you could just go into that a little bit.
Yeah, I would say, and again, read the book if you're really interested. There is a draw. I mean, I liked the smells and bells, sure. But that's kind of like saying I like my wife's hair. I'm not going to make a life-changing marriage decision because her hair is pretty. It's a factor, sure, but it's definitely not enough to make that kind of decision around. there are not very many evangelical churches that do that kind of stuff, but they're there. I mean, I remember I can't remember what it was called, that emergent church movement or whatever. That was happening, right around that time, or a little before. So you could find catacombs and all these kind of hipster evangelical churches that had candles and incense. I mean, or you could just go home and do it. I mean, I burned incense in my office out there just because I thought it was cool. So you didn't need that. You didn't need that to be leaving evangelicalism. So for me, it was very much, on the one hand, I felt pushed out because I had these issues that were not being answered. I mean, I have top guys, people that have written books on the subject that are not answering the issues to my satisfaction. The draw in was really fairly minor, to be honest with you. I liked Eastern Orthodoxy as far as what it looked like, but I knew that just philosophically and theologically, it just wasn't ever going to fit. So that's where the draw kind of ended for me. Plus, I knew that there's a whole Eastern Rite of Catholicism that still does all that cool stuff. So, that was going to be open to me if I became Catholic either way. But no, I mean, I wasn't drawn to Mary. I wasn't drawn to the hierarchy. I wasn't drawn to some of the teachings, for sure. It's a pain being Catholic, compared to being evangelical. It's not a party. And I certainly wasn't looking forward to the trouble it was causing, my family. I wasn't looking forward to losing my job. I wasn't looking forward to quitting my PhD. So this idea that, they have incense, so he became Catholic, I mean, that's just absurd. That's so far from the truth. That's if anybody said that about me, at least, they would be, way so far off, it wouldn't even be worth answering. So was there a draw? Yes, there was a draw. But, what people maybe don't realize as evangelicals is you can get almost everything you want just by being evangelical. I could have just gone and started my own church, and we could have all the incense and bells and read Thomas Aquinas. Like I could have crafted, just much as Norm did, I could have crafted a church that did that stuff. So yeah, there really was very little draw. I would say it was like probably 85% feeling pushed out by the issues and 15% being drawn to the Catholic Church, especially. That was not a big factor in it. We had been taught that there's something called the essentials. Those are the things you have to believe to be a Christian. And then there's the non-essentials, and that's the stuff you can disagree over. And the more I looked into that, the more I just saw so many inconsistencies. I mean, Dr. Geisler himself, I think he published at least 3 times an article on the essentials, and every time he came up with a different list. I mean, it's in print. And then you have things like, he says, baptism and communion, those aren't essentials. You can disagree over those. Well, what's interesting is that Dr. Geisler said the way you tell if something is an essential is if it's connected to salvation. Well, I've got a verse in the Bible that says baptism now saves you. I've got John chapter 6 that says, if you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, you don't have eternal life. Those sound like salvation issues, and yet he never included those in his list. It was just all very circular and very question-begging. And again, it made me realize that when you look at Mormonism, how come a Mormon's disagreements with Baptists or a Jehovah's Witness disagreements with Presbyterians mark them as a non-Christian cult, but Baptists and Presbyterians are okay together? Like, where is that in Scripture? It can't be reverse engineering the essentials, because the guy that was like the hero of doing that never succeeded. And so once again, I thought, well, it's the creeds, right? It's the Nicene Creed. It's these creeds that the church came up with that historically always determined orthodoxy. But once again, that pushes you back to this ancient church that really has nothing to do with evangelicalism. And so those two things doctrinally, I think, really pushed me toward the ancient church. And then just seeing problems with sola scriptura and sola fide pretty quickly, basically removed the 2 pillars of the Reformation. And with those 4 things happening all at the same time, it was, pretty much clear where this was going to end up.
Mm-hmm. So did you engage with other professors and folks at SES to try to hash some of these theological issues out? If so, I mean, was that helpful? Were there any arguments or reasons that you thought, this is a pretty tough one to overcome? Or how did that go?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much everybody I talked to was involved with SES. We had all learned this. We'd all taken the same logic classes. We'd all taken the same hermeneutics classes. we pretty much all knew the same things in a lot of ways. And so to me, if the answer was going to be found, it was going to be found there, because I wasn't going to go become some presuppositional, reform guy
Right.
to not become Catholic. So to me, it was going to have to come from the people that read Aquinas and knew these guys. So yeah, I would bring the issues up. In fact, I wrote papers on these issues. I wrote a paper on the canon. I wrote a paper on Orthodoxy for my PhD, level people. So and those papers were presented generally in classes. They weren't just something you turned in and then got a grade on. So none of this in my mind was happening in some dark, shadowy corner of the seminary where all the people that like the Catholics were getting together and secretly meeting, and just the way the story kind of went down. That's the way it was described by a lot of people. But the reality was, I was talking about this stuff. I was talking about it in the classes that I taught. I was talking about this stuff with my professors, going kind of up the line. And I was also talking with fellow professors, that were friends and that kind of thing. And, once I kind of got to the point where I was offering responses that I thought made sense, that's when things started to get a little testy. I was kind of starting to find out who my real friends were, because anybody who could see the writing on the wall and say, wait a minute, this issue, what's the answer? In fact, I remember speaking at your church one time. I think Devin maybe invited, I don't remember who, Devin was there. There was a bunch of people there. And all I talked about was the difficulty with the canon and the difficulty with Orthodoxy. And one of the first comments I got was, well, I'm not becoming Catholic. And I hadn't even brought up Catholicism,
Right.
It was just so obviously the answer that everybody else kind of got it, maybe even in a sense before I did. There really isn't any other answer here. And so what was happening was my brighter students were starting to call me out. I was starting to get reported. I had to get before the faculty and get grilled a few times. Talking about an inquisition. They didn't put me on the rack or anything. But I was starting to get in serious trouble. And that's when I kind of had to excuse myself from several things. And I started attending an Anglican church that, at least now I can be safe. Now, the dean of SES was going to an Anglican church. And I went to his Anglican church. So I knew I wasn't going to get in trouble there. But I did find it kind of funny that, these guys were quite comfortable with many of the conclusions that I was starting to reach. And yet, if I said anything about it in class, I would get hammered. Well, a big part of the reason was that a lot of evangelicals don't realize that they're as far from Protestant denominations as they are from Catholicism in a lot of ways. Protestants baptize babies. Many Protestants have a very high view of the communion. Many of them celebrate sacraments like confirmation and stuff like that. And what I started to realize was, basically, if you're not Baptist, you're going to be in trouble here, because you were either Baptist or you were Catholic. Those are like the only two categories that a lot of the people seem to be able to see. So yes, I did talk to a lot of people. I didn't feel like I was having anything to hide. But yeah, there were conversations I had with certain people like you and Jason and some of these other guys that I got to the point where I couldn't have them anymore with people like Richard Howe or Tom Howe, because we would hit the wall. Okay, we're here, we're at the wall, and you're telling me that as a Baptist you can affirm the Nicene Creed, which is insane to me. As a Baptist you should not be able to affirm that unless you just change the meaning of a bunch of words. And once you get to that point, it's just why would we keep talking? Because this is obviously not going to settle the issues that I have. And to some extreme, I kind of felt like I'd done it already. I read Norm's book. Like, what else is Norm going to tell me that isn't already in his book? What's James White going to tell me that isn't already in his book? And until really about the last year, I wasn't even reading Catholics. I wasn't reading Scott Hahn and, Peter Crave, of course. All the Catholics that SES assigned me, I was reading. But as far as anything to try to get me to become Catholic, it was other evangelicals that were convincing me that there was no answer to these questions, because I had books by evangelicals on the very questions that I was asking. And at the end, they would basically just say, yeah, that's kind of what happened, but sola fide, so we're right, and that was about the end of it. So between, the witch hunts that were kind of beginning, between the way I saw other people treated at SES once they had become Catholic, and just the fact that I had just kind of gone as far as I could go with most everybody up to a certain point, then yeah, toward the end, I was really only talking to people that could keep up and, follow the conversation past where the others couldn't.
So in line with that, I mean, I'm looking at the public statements of kind of these back and forth conversation between you and Thomas Howe. And I remember when the first article came out publicly, I remember thinking, oh, great, this would be wonderful to have a response from Dr. Tom Howe, because, I mean, obviously we all respect him. He's a brilliant guy. And this, I was so overjoyed because I was talking to you and to Jay and other people, right, who would become Catholic. And I'm like, these are not bad arguments. These are not bad reasons for why they're converting. But I don't want to convert. So come on, Tom Howe, give it to me. Like, what?
If anyone.
And these articles came out, and I remember thinking, oh, really? Oh, that's really not good. And a big part of why I was disappointed, obviously, because I was hoping for a well-reasoned rebuttal to your claims and other people's claims like you. And it ended up being, gosh, I'm not even sure what the word to describe it is, but other than very disappointing. Like, it ended up being a bunch of rhetorical strategies, a bunch of, just, I guess, tactics to try to make you look bad instead of actually addressing what you had to say. And then you responded back and forth. But I guess I'm wondering, did the conversation with Dr. Tom Howe end there? Is that basically the sum of what he had to say about the conversion, your guys' converting, and the reasoning behind it?
To be fair, you should probably, I'll send you links to this stuff so that people can maybe scroll down to the description down there and click on them for themselves. And you should read Tom's article first before you read mine, because mine is a response to his. Now, that's as far as it went. The way the whole thing happened was he sent me his response and told me, this is my response to Evangelical Exodus, and it's going to be on the SES website. Hope you like it. And that was kind of the end of it. So I wrote, I didn't write a response to it. I think I maybe sent it to you or something. When it came out on the web, it was a little different than it was initially. But when they put it on the website, and SES made a pretty big deal out of this for a while. They were extremely mad when Evangelical Exodus came out. Mm-hmm. So when it became public, and it was the kind of thing that, like, okay, well, it's on now. This is no longer a dispute between friends. This is now an entire school that's responding to me using my colleagues' writing. That's when I put my response on my website, and that's where it ended. Tom, I sent him a link. I said, here's my response, and I never heard back. I've never, it's however many years ago that was the last time I ever heard from him, which was really disappointing too, because, Tom was a mentor to me. I loved him. I mean, he was, I think without question, the best professor that the seminary had.
Yeah.
And I'd say that to anybody.
Yeah.
His brother would say that about him. And I love Richard too.
Yeah.
Now Richard and I have stayed friends. We're still on, I can call Richard and it's not weird or anything. I will say though that Tom has had incredible physical distress for many, many years, way, a decade before this happened. He was almost out of his mind in pain. And I mean, he would tell you that. Yeah. He got better for a short period of time, and then he started to really decline again. And that's about the time that all of this happened. I mean, within a few years. So that was one thing, is that I kind of maybe chalk it up to that a little bit. But the other thing is, it's important to understand how Evangelical Exodus works. We all had lots of arguments. I mean, everybody there had graduated from a seminary that taught you how to do apologetics and argue. So we were well aware of the issues and the arguments for and against Catholicism. So as the editor, as the chapters were starting to come in and people were telling their personal stories, I started realizing, gosh, this is getting very repetitive because we're all talking about sola scriptura and we're all talking about sola fide and we're all, so what I proposed was that we remove all of that material and kind of consolidate it into a single chapter on each issue and move those to the end of the book as appendices so that it wouldn't disrupt the flow of the personal narratives and also wouldn't, be a million pages long and redundant. So that's what we did. Unfortunately, what Tom did was he only reacted to my chapter. So all the good arguments are in the appendices, but he treated my chapter as if it was just a standalone treatise, not only defending Catholicism, but attacking SES, which it wasn't. And really all the meat of the arguments were left out because they were in the appendices, which he did not address. So really just, even before his pen hit the paper, I think he was just setting himself up to do a really poor job on my personal conversion, at least, because he was ignoring the arguments that were made. And then, as you said, I just, I guess all I can say is read it and then read my response. But it really was actually shocking to me how poorly done it was. Massive amounts of rhetoric, there's a spot in there where it's literally 2 paragraphs of rhetorical questions,
right,
without any support on any of the alleged answers that you're supposed to come to, attacking me for not having sources, and then a paragraph later attacking my sources. I mean, it just, it wouldn't have passed his own class.
right.
If I had turned this in as a critique to him, he would have, the paper would have weighed more with all the red ink that he would have spilled on that paper. And yeah, it was very disappointing. I was shocked that SES would even post it, but it was the best they had. So,
well, I think that's what was so stunning, because sitting in Dr. Howe's class, he's rigorous, he's thoughtful, insightful, right? And this just did not exemplify any of that. Right. It wasn't until like the 3rd article. I did read all through all of the articles. It wasn't until the 3rd article that it seemed like there was actual engagement with some of the ideas. So I think that was shocking, and I think that I'm just as an SES grad, I was really hoping for some help with dealing with you.
Well, and even part 3. I mean, just not trying to completely throw this under the bus, but he spent almost a quarter of his original response on a single argument against the Catholic interpretation of Matthew 16:18. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build the church. And his conclusion was, well, see, Catholicism isn't necessarily right. Like, okay, well, first of all, that's one verse out of all the verses in there. Number 2, he's attacking the writings of a person that I didn't even cite or even know who he was at the time. And number 3, at best, he just said, well, see, it isn't necessarily the case. Well, okay. I mean, and that's part of part 3. I mean, that's like the engagement part.
Right. I know.
So, even the best, even when he finally kind of gets his old, mojo back and starts getting scholarly, he wastes it on a discussion of a verse that isn't even really that important to my arguments. You're right. I think it was a huge disappointment.
I guess, and moving maybe a little bit in a different direction, how has Catholicism deepened your faith? I mean, I would think that since you've converted to Catholicism, you felt like that has deepened your faith. Is that fair to say?
I think it's expanded it, maybe. I'm not sure what deepening would mean. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I mean, like, if I were to respond, I don't feel like I have a deeper faith in the Trinity. I'm reading better people on what the Trinity doctrine is, and maybe coming to understand it better. And I think that it's filled in a lot of holes for me. Just to kind of get off of the argument thing for a while, one thing that always I found kind of distressing about evangelicalism was just the physicality of evangelicalism was just always so weird. It's okay to have a church and a movie theater or a gym. It's okay to be, have a coffee shop in the hall, and you stand up to sing and you sit down and that's it. Um, and just, the whole aesthetic was just weird. You're basically a guy on a stage. And I think I had kind of, in a sense, a sort of a sacramental worldview, even as an evangelical. Like there's something more to all of this than just what the thoughts are in my head. And so I think that the expression of the faith is so much better when you look at Orthodoxy or Catholicism. That we're not souls riding around in bodies. Like this is really what we are as humans. A soul body unity is what we are. And so, yeah, it matters if your Bible is 3 feet high and made of leather, or it's a paperback with Bill and Ted on the front stuffed in your back pocket. I mean, that matters. It matters if you have candles versus lasers. It matters if you have Gregorian chant versus, Hillsong United songs. These things matter. But as an evangelical, I was never able to express that. And as an evangelical, I was distressed that the fastest growing and biggest churches were almost always the worst ones. Not necessarily theologically, although often theologically, but they were always like the grossest instantiation of just kind of the rock concert type thing and the coffee shop Christians. And as an evangelical, I just didn't really have a very good response to that, because the most I could say is, well, I don't like that.
Right.
But unless they were rank heretics, I couldn't really complain with any consistency as an evangelical. Whereas becoming Catholic, it's like, oh, now I know why I thought those things. Those intuitions have been fulfilled now. And so I feel like there's more of me worshiping than there was before.
Okay. Yeah, so it's not so much you feel more saintly all the time.
That's quite the opposite. Wow, all these things are sins too? Dang, yeah. Catholic guilt is a real thing.
Yeah, I've heard that. My dad grew up Catholic, and that was pretty much the thing he remembered about Catholicism was guilt.
Yeah. Well, but of course, we have the sacrament of confession, so we can get rid of it a lot easier, but there's more of it to get rid of.
Yeah, and I guess you could probably make the case that having guilt is appropriate when you do bad things, right?
Yeah.
And that's in the evangelical world, did you ever feel that? Did you ever feel like, not just obviously you had feelings of guilt, but I mean, were your feelings of guilt something that flowed out of your understanding of the faith, or were they tangential to it?
No, it was a part of it. I mean, if it was something bad enough that it was recognized as being evil, then sure, But I think that there's just sort of this like instant pressure valve release that you have in evangelicalism that you don't have in Catholicism. Like I remember our dean, Barry Leventhal, one of his favorite statements about sin was "fess 'em as you does 'em," or something like that. But what that lends itself to is like, oh, I committed adultery, sorry God, and then pressure's off, I'm good again. Not that I was ever not good, because once saved always saved, so no matter what I do, I'm okay. Wherever you fall on that spectrum as an evangelical, when there's basically no teeth because you're saved no matter what, and all you got to do is just say sorry, and now you've repented. It's easy to kind of keep the guilt at bay, because you're just in a perpetual state of on your way to heaven all the time. And unless you really hurt somebody or something and need to make amends, repentance is nothing more than just changing your mind about whether something's right or wrong. It's a very different thing in Catholicism, because when you sin at a particular level and you've really like actually threatened your relationship with God, or even lost saving grace, the way you get it back is by going to confession and talking to a priest. You can't just toss up a quick sorry and everything's back again. It's a very different system, I guess, when it comes to that. But to me, it also feels a lot more real. You're reading scripture, you confess to each other. Jesus tells the apostles, whatever sin, you keep is kept. And, it's like, yeah, when that priest says you're forgiven, you really are. And there's just something very powerful with that, again, even if it's wrong, psychologically, it's a lot better. But I also happen to think that it's correct.
Sure. Do you think being an evangelical helped you at all in being a better Catholic, or did it
Oh
not?
yeah.
Or okay.
Yeah, I mean, for every virtue, there's two vices, right? So, it's very hard in this fallen world to not be further away from the virtue than you wish. And, there are things about Catholicism that come from, that are, essential to Catholicism in the same way that some problems with evangelicalism are essential to it. So just for example, with a very high sacramental view of the world, it's very easy to just show up to Mass, do your thing, and walk out to a whole other life, and feel fine about it because you got that Eucharist. That's Jesus. Whether you're a good person or a bad person, you just had the Eucharist. Whether you're a good person or a bad person, you can have a baptism for your kids. Now the church works very hard to help people see that, and you can't get any sacrament here without going through classes and sessions, and everything's a really big deal. But at the end of the day, it's almost easier to be kind of a Sunday Catholic, than it is to be a Sunday evangelical, because as an evangelical, you're not getting anything from church that you couldn't just get by reading a book or turning on the radio, right? In fact, it's probably better if you did that. You'd probably get better messages than your pastor's giving you, and you'd probably sing better songs. And, there's no reason to go to church other than, well, you think you should. Whereas in Catholicism, you can't get the things you need without coming to Mass. There's no, you can't get the Eucharist any other way. You can't get confession any other way. But what that means is that your average evangelical church is filled with people that want to be there because they don't have to be. There's really no reason to go unless you just really want to be there and you really like it. Whereas a Catholic, you need to go whether you want to or not, because there's things you can only get that way. And so, yeah, what you end up with is a lot of Catholic churches that have, I would say, more unfaithful, or, whatever you want to call it, not as into it, people sitting there in the pew as you do in an evangelical church, where pretty much everybody is there because this is what they want. Mm-hmm. And of the 700 churches in this town, this is the one I like the best. Well, of course, you're going to be a lot more enthusiastic about that than if you're just going to a place where you need to sit there for an hour, no matter how good or bad it is, until you get that sacrament, and then you can leave. That's going to foster, a totally different kind of mindset. And again, just like teaching, education's a huge part of my job. When I would teach a class at an evangelical church, everybody that showed up was there, again, because they wanted to learn. So, it's kind of like going to a concert and, you're the opening band, nobody cares about you, and you got to work really hard to keep your energy up. But in the Catholic Church, almost everything I teach because someone has to take the class or they don't get something they want. And so now I'm the opening band, right? Now everyone's there because they have to be, and I've got to really, pour it on to have a good time. And sometimes it's hard because a lot of people they're sitting there looking at you and they don't want to be there.
Right.
So it's just odd, again, it's a mix of human nature and just the fact that we live in a fallen, finite world, and there's just only so much you can do. But the challenges in the Catholic Church are very different than evangelicalism. But I think, to come around to your question, the reason it helps me is that because I know how the evangelical world worked and where its strengths lied, I've been able to apply some of those. So just to give one example, a huge irony of the Catholic Church is that, they want families to have as many kids as they can, pretty much, but then they have no support for families whatsoever. You go to Mass, that baby's going to sit in your lap, and if it's screaming, there's nowhere. Maybe they have a cry room, but there's no nurseries. They don't have Sunday school. The family goes to Mass together. That's what you're supposed to do. And the trouble is that's translated into things like classes. So I try to teach a class on Scripture, and trying to get them to offer child support, it's like pulling teeth. If we just had a room for kids to go to, the parents could both come. They wouldn't have to leave somebody at home watching the kids. There's all of this trouble that is caused by not offering babysitting and childcare and stuff. And it's it's amazing to me how few Catholic churches do that for people, even though they're the ones that want you to have a million kids. So by telling them, listen, you offer something where their kids get taken care of for an hour, man, people will show up to that just to get the babysitting. So I've been able to apply some of those kinds of ethos to what we do as Catholics, and I think that's been able to help.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. And
yeah, it was great to be on.
Yeah.
And you'll be on my show soon, so
I'm looking forward to it.
We'll do this again.
Yep. Thanks a lot.